treated me like I was one of them. I'm talking about Frank and Veda. I was talking about this the other day, and somebody asked me who the 5 greatest ball players I ever saw were. That's a tough one. Not because I couldn't think of 5. Hell, I could probably give you 20. I played a long time. When you spend that many years in the big leagues, you see just about everything. I saw guys who could hit, guys who could run, guys with arms you didn't test twice, and pitchers who could make you start thinking about your next at-bat before the one you were having was even over. So I thought about it for a while, and the funny thing is I didn't start thinking about statistics. I started seeing people. I could see certain guys standing in the outfield again. I could see pitchers walking around the mound. I could remember sitting in the dugout watching somebody on the other team and thinking, how the hell are we going to get this guy out today? That's what stays with you. People probably think players don't watch other players very much. We do. We just don't talk about it. I wasn't going over to Willie Mays before a game and telling him how much I admired him. I was trying to beat him. Same with Hank Aaron. Same with Gibson. Same with everybody. That was baseball. But you knew who the great ones were. Everybody in the clubhouse knew. Sometimes nobody even had to say the guy's name. You'd be going over things before a series, and somebody would mention one situation, and everybody knew exactly who they were talking about. I was lucky that way. I came along at a time when there were some unbelievable ball players still around, and then I stayed around long enough to see another generation come through. Some of them were opponents. Some became friends, and one of them spent a whole lot of years sitting in the same clubhouse I did. So if you ask me now, after all this time, which 5 I remember most, these are the guys that come to mind. Roberto Clemente was one of the first names I thought about. I saw a lot of Roberto because we were both in the National League, and Pittsburgh and Cincinnati saw plenty of each other in those days. He was a funny player to watch. I don't mean funny like he was doing anything strange. I mean, there were things Roberto could do that made you look twice. His arm was one of them. Everybody knew about that arm. I was always looking for an extra base. That was just how I played. If I thought there was even a little chance of getting 90 more feet, I wanted it. But when the ball went to Clemente, you paid attention. I remember seeing throws come in from right field and thinking, Jesus, where did that come from? He could really throw. But Roberto was more than an arm. The thing I remember is how seriously he played. You could tell the game mattered to him. I understood that because it mattered to me the same way. We weren't the same kind of player. Roberto had things physically that I never had. But when I watched him, I understood the way he approached the game. There was no fooling around once the game started. And Pittsburgh had some good clubs. You'd walk into that ballpark, look across the field, and there was Clemente. After enough years, certain players just became part of your baseball life. You expected to see them, then one day, you don't anymore. That's the part nobody thinks about while you're playing. At the time Roberto was an opponent, I wanted to get a hit. I wanted Cincinnati to win. If I could take an extra base on him, I was going to try, even if everybody told me not to. Years later, you remember it differently. You remember the uniform. You remember the arm. You remember the way the guy carried himself. And you realize you were pretty lucky to have been on the same field with him that many times. Roberto was that kind of player for me. I respected the hell out of him. Bob Gibson. Now, there was a guy you remembered. I faced Bob a lot over the years, and I don't remember us having too many friendly conversations when I was standing at the plate. That wasn't Bob. He had the baseball. I had the bat. We both knew what we were there for. I actually liked that about him. There was no nonsense. People always ask me if I was afraid to face Gibson. No. I respected him. There's a difference. You couldn't play the way I played and spend your time worrying about getting knocked down. If Bob threw one inside, I got out of the dirt, picked up the bat, and got back in there. Maybe he'd come inside again. That was baseball back then. But I'll tell you what I remember about Gibson more than anything else. He competed every pitch. Some pitchers could have great stuff and still give you something during an at-bat. Maybe they'd lose concentration. Maybe they'd make one lazy pitch. Bob didn't give you much. You'd stand in there waiting for a mistake, and sometimes you waited all afternoon. I understood that kind of stubbornness. I was pretty stubborn myself. That's probably why I enjoyed facing guys like him. I didn't want the easy guy. If I got a hit off Gibson, I knew I'd earned the damn thing. And there were days when he got me. Plenty of them. You went back to the dugout, sat down, thought about what he'd thrown you, and waited for another chance. That was the nice thing about baseball. If a guy beat you in the first inning, maybe you saw him again in the fourth. Then maybe again in the seventh. You kept coming back. When I think about Bob now, I don't really think about numbers. I remember looking out at that mound and seeing him there. Serious as hell. Ready to work. And I knew I had to be ready too. There weren't many pitchers who could make every at-bat feel that way. Gibson could. Willie Mays was already Willie Mays when I got to the big leagues. I was a rookie, trying to prove I belonged, and Willie had been doing it for years. Everybody knew number 24. The funny thing about Willie was that after you played against him enough, you almost got used to seeing him out there. Almost. Then he'd do something and remind you who you were watching. I remember balls being hit in the center field that looked pretty good coming off the bat. You'd think somebody had a hit, maybe even extra bases. Then Willie would get there. That happened a lot. And I used to enjoy watching him run. He had a way of moving around that outfield that looked natural. I was never like that. Everything I did looked like work. I ran hard. I slid hard. I threw myself around. Willie could make the game look easier than it really was. I probably envied that a little bit. But what I respected most was that underneath all that talent, he was a competitor. People remember the catches and the home runs. Players notice other things. You notice whether a guy is still paying attention when his team is losing. You notice how he runs the bases. You notice whether he wants the ball when something important is happening. Willie always seemed to be in the game. And I saw him when he was older too. That stays with me. Nobody beats age. Not Willie, not me, not anybody. The legs slow down. Things that used to happen naturally start taking a little more effort. But when Willie walked onto a baseball field, he was still Willie Mays. You knew it. I never spent much time during my career telling opponents how good they were. I figured they heard enough of that already. But now, yeah, I can say it. I was lucky. I got to stand on the same field and watch Willie Mays play baseball. Not many people can say that. And I got to do it over and over again. Hank Aaron was another one. I saw Hank for a lot of years, and the thing I remember about him is how little attention he seemed to need. Some great players had big personalities. Hank didn't need that. He'd come to the ballpark, do his work, get his hits, and pretty soon you looked up and realized he'd hurt you again. I always respected that. When Hank came to the plate, you paid attention because he could hit just about anything, and he didn't look like he was trying to tear the cover off the ball every time. That was the strange part. I was different. Everybody knew when I was playing. I was running around talking, sliding, getting dirty. That was me. Hank could be quiet and still control the ball game. I remember watching him hit and thinking how simple he made it look. Pitch came in. Hank swung. Ball went somewhere hard. Then he'd stand on first or trot around the bases like he'd done it 1,000 times before, which I guess he practically had. And Atlanta wasn't always the easiest place for an opposing team. You knew when Aaron was coming up because the whole feeling in the ballpark changed. But Hank never seemed to change with it. That impressed me. Later on, when he was getting close to Babe Ruth's record, there was attention everywhere. Everybody wanted something from him. Reporters, fans, people who probably hadn't watched a Braves game all year. I'd known Hank as a ball player long before all that. So when people started talking about him like he was just a home run number that wasn't the Hank Aaron I remembered, I remembered the guy you had to worry about every time Cincinnati played his club. The guy who never seemed to give away an at-bat. The guy who could beat you without making a big show out of it. That's hard to do for one season. Hank did it year after year after year. When you play as long as I did, you see plenty of good hitters. You forget some of them. I never forgot Hank. Johnny Bench has to be number one for me. I spent too many years with the guy for him not to be. When people talk about Johnny, they usually start with what he could do behind the plate. I understand that. I had a pretty good view of it myself. But when you play with somebody year after year, you stop thinking about him the way fans do. Johnny was just Johnny. He was in the clubhouse when I got there. He was on the bus. He was sitting in the dugout. He was there during batting practice. You spend that much time together and a guy becomes part of your everyday life. That's what I remember now. I remember looking toward home plate and seeing him back there. That made you feel pretty good. Johnny had that arm and everybody knew about it. Guys on the other team knew about it too. You could see runners thinking twice before they went anywhere. I enjoyed that. Anything that made the other team uncomfortable was fine with me. And Johnny could hit. There were plenty of times I'd get on base and look toward the plate knowing we had the right guys coming up behind me. With those Cincinnati teams, you always felt like something could happen. Johnny was a big part of that feeling. But the thing people forget about those years is how much time we spent together when nothing important was happening. That's baseball. Everybody remembers October. I remember April. I remember some hot afternoon in July when everybody was tired. I remember sitting around the clubhouse. I remember hearing the same guys tell the same stories we'd already heard 50 times. Johnny was there for all of it. We had our personalities. We didn't always see everything the same way. You put a bunch of competitive guys together for that many years and you're going to have some disagreements. But when the game started, none of that mattered. He was my teammate, and I knew what kind of player was standing behind that plate. Looking back, I played with a lot of good baseball players. Some great ones too. But Johnny, I got to watch one of the best ever from about as close as you could possibly get for a lot of years. That's something I appreciate a hell of a lot more now than I did then. You know, when you play baseball, as long as I did, you meet a lot of people. Some guys stay in your mind, others don't. That's just the way it is. I can't sit here and tell you I remember every pitcher I faced or every guy who stood across the field from me. There were too many games, too many cities, too many summers. But those 5, I remember them. I remember Clemente standing out in right field and knowing you better be damn sure before you tried taking another base. I remember Gibson on the mound looking like he didn't particularly care whether you enjoyed facing him. I remember Willie running around center field making difficult things look a whole lot easier than they were. I remember Hank quietly going about his business and somehow hurting you before the afternoon was over. And Johnny. Hell, Johnny was there for so much of my life. That's different. When you get older, you start realizing the games aren't really what you miss. Sure, I miss playing. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. But I think what you really miss is walking into a ballpark and then knowing all those people are going to be there. You knew where everybody sat. You knew who talked too much. You knew who didn't talk enough. You knew who you wanted at the